Hey guys, Lincoln here. Today I want to talk to you about JavaScript functions and how you use them to execute specific pieces of your program while keeping your code organized and dry. Let's get to it. Okay guys, I'm here in the editor and we have our editor right here and we have our console out here. So we're going to type over here and everything's going to print out over here. What we have here is a dog object, and that dog has a name, an age, and that dog can bark and it can greet someone. So these last two properties of this dog are functions, and each of these functions do a specific thing. The first one will tell the dog to bark, and the second one tells the dog to greet and then bark. So let's see how that works before we dive into the foundations of this. So if we call dog.bark, the dog will bark, woof woof. Now if we call dog.greet and give it a argument of someone's name, let's give it my name, Lincoln, it will say, "Hi Lincoln, my name is Buddy and I am 7 years old, woof woof." So it greets the person that we provided. It tells the person its name and its age, and then it barks. So now let's take a look at exactly how we're doing it. The purpose of functions in JavaScript is to organize your program into small executable pieces of code that you can call as needed to do a specific action. And those actions can do something and then return to you the result, or just do what they have to do and end their execution. So let's take a look at how we define a function in JavaScript. To start, we have to type the keyword function and then give the function a name. Let's say bark. And that bark function can do something within these brackets. So in here is the code block. And in this code block, we can just do whatever we want, but let's just bark. Let's do woof woof. And so when we call this bark method, now that it's defined up here, we can actually call it by typing this name and opening and closing parentheses. And so now when we call it, it says woof woof, just as we told it to. But we can go even further. Our functions can take arguments to help us shape the result of the function. So we don't just want our dog to bark. We want it to bark in some way, some sound that we give it. So we can give it a sound and tell it to bark like we tell it to. So let's give it a sound. And if we call this function now and don't provide sound argument, it prints undefined. So let's tell it exactly what we want it to say. Let's make our dog meow, because why not? So now our dog, when we call the bark method, it says meow. We can make it say anything. We can make it say moo, like a cow, and it does exactly that. So this is called an argument. This sound is called an argument, and we can provide more arguments to this. We can tell it how many, or we can tell it to bark at someone. So let's give it a name to bark at. And we can print that name. And again, once we hit save, 1 second, let's give it a name, Lincoln. And it moves at Lincoln. And we can change this back to woof woof. So right there we see that we're calling this bark method with two arguments, the sound and the name. And then we use those arguments in our code block to do something. But what if we want to make a function that returns something? Let's do that. Let's make a function that would take two arguments, two numbers, and add them together and return to us the sum. So let's call that method sum. And that method will take number 1 and number 2. And this method needs to do some work and then return the result to us. So let's have it return number 1 plus number 2. And let's see what happens when we call it. So sum, and we can console.log the result and give it 1 and 2. So when we call sum with 1 and 2 as arguments, those are passed to the sum method function, and number 1 is 1 and number 2 is 2. And 1 plus 2 is 3. So what if we want to store this result somewhere else and then use it later in our program? So let's make this result the sum of 1 and 2 equals that, and then we can actually just print out, sum of 1 and 2. And again, it prints out 3. So what if we want to take this result and pass it into sum as the first argument, and then give it 8. And so when we do that, it says 3, because that's the sum of 1 and 2, plus 8 is 11, and it prints that out. Now, let's say we want our function to do some work before it returns. So we can do that. We can store our result as a variable, const result equals number 1 plus number 2, and then we return that result. So console.log sum of 1 and 2. And we can even shape the result even further. So we can say the sum of number 1 and number 2 is result. And so now it's going to print out, once we get the result here, it's going to print out what that is. So as we told it to, it says the sum of 1 and 2 is 3. So if we change this to, if we actually remove this, we don't need this anymore, we can just put it here, and we change this to 18 or 28. It prints out the sum of 1 and 28 is 29. So that's how we make a function. We do some work in it, and then we return the result. But what if we want to do some work after we return the result? Well, let's see what happens if we try to do that. So let's just say console.log after result returned. And then we can say here console.log before result returned, and see what happens. So when we call our method again and we refresh, it prints out before result returns, and then it prints out this, the sum of 1 and 28 is 29, because that's what we returned from the function. But it never prints out after result returned. Why is that? Because the point of the return statement is it's saying that we've done all the work we have to do, and here is the result. And it's given the result to the caller, and the caller can expect that nothing else will happen after that. So this function ends right when you call return. So it returns what you tell it to, and that's it. Nothing else happens. The function is done executing. So you can't do anything else afterwards. That's why we didn't see after result returned. So what if we want to make our function return different results based on the arguments that are provided? Let's see how that will work by building a simple calculator. And to do that, let's make a function and call it calculate, and take in a action, which would be either to add or multiply. And then it will take in two numbers as before, number 1 and number 2. Now, our function has to return some result. So what we should do is check what the action is. And we want to check if the action equals sum or add. Then we want to return the sum 1 plus number 1 plus number 2 to the caller. And if the action is equal to multiply, then we want to return the number 1 plus number 2. Or actually, want to multiply them. So number 1 times number 2. Otherwise, else, let's just return an error message that says the action is unknown. So we don't know how to handle this action because it's not add and it's not multiply. So our calculator is very simple. All it does is add or multiply two numbers. Now, just to be clear, let's print out console.log after return from calculator or calculate. This line should never print because we're going to return here, here, or here. So let's see how it works. First, by calling it with, of course, we want to console.log because otherwise we can't see the result. On the console.log, the calculation of adding 2 and 3. And once we refresh, it prints out 5 because calculate adds, that's this branch, it adds number 1 and number 2 because action is equal to add because that's what we provided right here. And we provided 2 and 3. So what if we want to multiply? We can call that function, again, we can call the function as many times as we want. This is the point of creating functions so that we can take a specific action and isolate it into one piece of one function that we can call over and over again as we need and get the result. So now we can call multiply with 2 and 3, and that should return 6. So the first one was an addition of 2 and 3, and then the multiplication of 2 and 3 is 6. Now let's try to call this function again with another action. Let's say divide and pass in 2 and 3. When we refresh, it says the action divide is unknown because we don't know how to handle action called divide. All we know is add and multiply. Otherwise, we return an error message. So that's how you make your function return different results based on the arguments that are provided. Now let's return to this line. This line is never printed out here because as we saw before, once you return from the function, nothing below that return statement is executed. So we can return and then print this out and print this out and also here. And once we refresh, nothing changes because we have returned and nothing after that return statement is executed. Let's remove these useless pieces of or dead pieces of code. And let's take a look at what we're doing here again. Because when we started, I pointed out that the point of functions is to organize your code into smaller executable pieces of code that you can call over and over again. The reason we want to do this in programming is because we want to keep our code dry. Dry stands for do not repeat yourself. So if we wanted to run add without functions, we can do console.log 1 plus 2 and then 1 plus 3 over and over again. But we shouldn't have to do that. We should just have a function that does that for us. And that's exactly why we created the calculate method. So instead of doing 1 plus 2, we can just say calculate, add 1 and 2. And we won't have to remember how to do an addition or multiplication or division every time. Another principle is to make sure that your functions only do a single thing, the single responsibility function or principle. We could have a function that does a whole bunch of things, but that's not the best way to design your program. You want each of your functions to do a specific action, return the result, and move on. So that's why when we created our sum function, we just had it take two numbers, number 1 and number 2, and had it return the sum of those two numbers. But what if we had it print out the multiplication of this number? The product is number 1 times number 2. And then we can print out the result, sum 1 and 2. So now when we refresh, I messed up. When we refresh, it prints out 3. But it also printed out the product of 2. The product is 2. When we call this function sum with 1 and 2, we expect it to return to us the sum of the number 1 and 2. But when we look at the console after calling it, it first prints out this product, the multiplication of 1 and 2, and then it returns to us the addition, the sum. This is a function that does not adhere to the single responsibility principle because it's doing more than one thing. It's expected to return to us the sum, but it's also printing out some other thing that we don't expect, the multiplication of the two numbers. So this function is bad. You would want to just have your function do exactly what it says it's going to do and return. And so now our function has a single responsibility. If we want to make another function that does multiplication, we can do that. We can say multiply number 1 and number 2. And that will return the number 1 times number 2, the product. And now we can call multiply with, let's do 4 and 2. And when we refresh, we have our sum here, and we have our multiplication of 4 and 2 right here. So these two functions adhere to the single responsibility principle because they do a single thing, return, and do nothing else. That is how you want your functions to be designed. And that is how you keep your code easily readable and easier for other engineers to join you and reason about. If you make your functions do multiple things and are all over the place, it's going to be hard for other engineers to understand what's going on. And within a few weeks after you wrote it, you won't understand what's going on because it's doing too much. So when you're designing your functions, make sure they do a single thing and do it well. So let's return to our dog from the beginning of this video. Our dog was an object. We declared it as an object and called it dog and gave it 4 properties. We gave it a name, buddy. We gave it age, 7. And then we gave it 2 methods, 2 functions. And the functions were called bark. And the bark method took in a sound that was optional, and it just console logged that sound, or by default wolf wolf. So if sound is not provided, it's going to just print out wolf wolf. So if we provide a sound, say meow, it will print out meow instead of wolf wolf. Now let's take a deeper look at this line. Remember, when we first created our functions, we would give it a name right here after we write the keyword and then the argument. But we don't have to do that when we're setting the function onto an object as a property because the name is already declared right here. And then it's set equal to this function. So we don't have to type the name here again. That's redundant and unnecessary. So we have that done, and we don't have to do it like this. So now let's move on to the next method. The next method was greet. And the dog should greet someone by their name or person name. And our dog would do that by printing out console.log hi person name, and then saying my name is this dot name. So let's take a look at this real quick. We're accessing the name property of the dog. So let's just do a dot notation right here, and we can see that when we type dot, we can access the age variable or property. We can access the bark method. We can access the greet method. We can access the name of this dog object because they're declared on this. So when you call a function on an object, this stands for the context in which this function is declared. So in this case, the context is within this dog object. And so this refers to all of this object's properties. And so now we can access the properties, individual properties on that object. So we can access the dog's name. And we can access, and I am this dot age years old. So now our dog can greet the person who we provided to our function as an argument, and it can say its own name and its age. One more thing, let's make our dog, as part of his greeting, let's call the bark method, because dogs bark when they greet people. So now we can tell it to bark, and we can even give it a sound, and we'll make it wolf 3 times instead of twice. Wolf, 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 and make an explanation. And instead of doing it twice, we're doing it 3 times. So it's going to be wolf, wolf, wolf as the sound, and we're going to print out the sound. Now, let's take a look on how to actually call this method. So we've defined these functions on this object, dog. So let's call them. Let's call dog dot bark, and dog dot bark will print wolf wolf because we didn't provide a sound. Let's now call dog dot greet. Remember, we have all these properties that we can access on the dog object because we define them. So we can call dog dot greet, and let's just see what happens if we don't provide any arguments. It prints out hi undefined. My name is Buddy and I am 7 years old. Why is it printing out hi undefined? Well, it's because we didn't provide a argument for person.name. So person.name is undefined right here. So let's provide it my name, Lincoln. And now once we refresh, it says, hi Lincoln, my name is Buddy and I am 7 years old. Wolf, wolf, wolf. So it runs its greeting by printing out that line that we wrote, and then it calls the bark method on the dog itself. And that's how you define a function on an object and then call it. To call it, remember, you have to access the object's property by doing dog.greet and calling the method. So what if we want to just call greet? Let's refresh, and it says in our console that greet is not defined. Why? Because greet is not defined anywhere in this scope. So if we actually define greet right here and just make it some general greeting that says hello world, then greet should work because we've defined it in this scope. But if we want to call the dog's greet method, we have to access that on the dog itself. So dog.greet. So never forget that. Remember, you can only access variables and functions that are defined in the scope. As I said, the function greet is not defined in the scope, but it is defined on dog. So you can call dog.greet. The same thing goes for bark. You cannot call bark because it's not defined in the scope. It is only defined on bark, on dog. So dog.bark yields wolf wolf. And that's it for defining functions on an object and accessing its properties within that function with this dot, and then accessing the name, age, and other functions. Now that you have learned all of this, let's make one last function as a congratulations to you, and we'll say congrats, and we'll take your name, and we will say console.log congrats name. You now know functions in JavaScript. And we will call congrats with someone's name. Let's say Tabitha. So now this function should print out, once we refresh, congrats Tabitha, you now know functions in JavaScript. And you can make this name anything you want. We'll make it Lincoln. And it says congrats Lincoln, you now know functions in JavaScript. That's all you have to know for now. There's a lot more to functions, but this is the basics, this is the foundation, and once you understand all of this, you will be very powerful as a JavaScript engineer. Okay guys, now we know how to define functions in JavaScript and give them a name and arguments, and use those arguments in the block of the code to shape the result of that function. And the function can either run an action and return nothing, or run the action and return the result of that action to the caller. And the caller can use that result to do something else. And we also learned how to practice the dry principle. Do not repeat yourself. By putting repeatable code in a function and calling it multiple times, instead of running that same code multiple times, we put it in a function and then call that function with arguments to shape the result of our function call. Furthermore, we learned how to practice the single responsibility principle by making our functions do one thing very well and moving on. Our functions should not do multiple things because that creates chaos and creates unpredictability. So you want your functions to be very predictable, take arguments, and use those arguments to shape the result and return, and then move on. We also learned how to define functions on objects. So we created an object called dog, we gave it a name, a age, and we gave it two functions, two properties that are functions called bark and greet. The dog can bark by calling dog.bark, and it can greet by calling dog.greet with a person's name as an argument. And a dog can use that argument to greet that person as well as access its own properties within the greet function. So by doing this.name and this.age, that function can access the properties of the dog. Functions are very foundational, and now that we understand them, we can do a lot more in JavaScript. I look forward to the next video, and if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe for future videos. And if you have any suggestions or questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.